It was a misty morning in 1804 when two prominent American statesmen faced each other with pistols in hand on the heights of Weehawken. One of the men was Alexander Hamilton, a founding father. The other, Aaron Burr, the sitting vice president. Moments later, a shot rang out, and Hamilton fell mortally wounded. The famous duel which cost Hamilton his life captured imaginations for over 2 centuries, and it's emblematic of the deadly rituals of honor that once prevailed among the gentlemanly circles. The practice of pistol duels, it invokes an image of frock-coated aristocrats at dawn, measured paces, and a tense countdown to that crack of gunfire. Yet beyond the romanticized scenes of film and literature, of course, lies a very real and complex history. Pistol dueling was not merely melodramatic theater, but it was a deeply ingrained social institution for resolving disputes of honor from the 17th through to the 19th centuries. It spanned continents and class, and claimed the lives of poets and politicians alike. So today, we are going to talk about the history of pistol duels. Bit of a random topic, perhaps not on your bingo card for today, but well, here we are. So settle in for the next hour. It's going to be an interesting one. Let me welcome you to the channel first. Hello to any newcomers. I invite you to click the subscribe button if you've not done yet, and I remind you that this is 100% ad-free because we hate advertisements as much as you do. So you can watch the video along with all the other videos on this channel from start to finish without having to be interrupted by something that you do not care about. Now, this is made possible because we are supported not by YouTube ads, but rather by the people on Patreon, YouTube memberships, also the occasional donation through Super Thanks and the PayPal link, along with the merch store with all of its coveted goodies. Perhaps you want to look at that through curiosity, and thank you very much to all the people supporting. If you want to become a member of that prestigious group, well, navigate yourself to the pinned comment and the video and channel description. You'll find where you need to go if you want to go there. But for now, let's all just get nice and relaxed, and we can begin our video for today. Thank you for listening to my introduction, and let's get on with the topic. Now, this concept of settling disputes through single combat goes back quite a long time, even all the way back to antiquity, and then the later medieval traditions of trial by battle. Let's just look at the Middle Ages first. In those times, European knights and nobles engaged in judicial duels, pretty much a legally sanctioned fight intended to let divine justice decide guilt or innocence. Now, these early duels were often fought with swords or polearms, sometimes in full armor and in view of a court. But by the late medieval period, however, the judicial duel kind of fell out of official favor. For example, let's look at France's last state-sanctioned trial by combat. That occurred in 1547, after which King Henry II outlawed the practice. Now, yet even as a legal trial by combat waned, personal duels of honor were on the rise, and that's a little bit harder to control in a legal sense. During the Renaissance, particularly in Italy and France, a culture of private dueling emerged among aristocrats. Matters of personal insult, rivalry and love, or disputes over reputation were increasingly settled by informal combat, following an honor code rather than in courts of law. And so in these 16th century duels, the weapons of choice were typically swords, such as rapiers in the French tradition, reflecting the knightly martial traditions carried into the early modern age. But the question remains at the fundamental basis of it. Why exactly would gentlemen of the upper class risk life and limb over a harsh word or slight? And that answer, of course, lies in the honor culture at the time. In early modern European societies, a man's honor, his reputation for courage, integrity, and social worth was pretty much the most important thing he had. Insults or accusations could gravely damage one's honor if they went unanswered. And without modern legal remedies for defamation or reliable policing of slander, men took the defense of their honor into their own hands. A challenge to duel was a way to demand satisfaction, a chance to prove one's courage, restore the reputation through bravery under fire. On the other hand, backing down from a challenge could label one as a coward, and, well, that follows you around for the rest of your life, doesn't it? So, paradoxically, dueling was seen as a way to uphold civility and respect by containing these feuds within these set rules. They functioned as a system for the distribution of respect, violence governed by an unwritten code of gentlemanly conduct. Now, as for England, dueling was not a native medieval tradition, so much as a continental import. During the Elizabethan era, Italian fencing masters and codes of chivalry became fashionable in the English court. By the 17th century, dueling had taken root among British nobles and officers as well. Meanwhile, over in Tsarist Russia, there was no deep chivalric legacy, but Western military officers introduced the practice. One of the first recorded Russian duels took place in 1666 between two Scotsmen who were actually serving in the Tsar's army. Well, across the Atlantic, European colonists carried dueling culture to the New World. The earliest duel in North America actually occurred as early as 1621 in colonial Massachusetts. Two servants fought with swords over an argument, though the Puritan authorities promptly punished them, showing New England's stern opposition to dueling. In any case, by contrast, in the southern colonies, and later in the young United States, dueling gained a stronger foothold among the planter and political classes as an accepted recourse for matters of honor, something where the law would take a back seat. We're not getting involved. You two sort it out, that kind of thing. But it is important to note that until the late 17th century, firearms were not the primary dueling weapons. You see, early firearms like wheel-lock and matchlock pistols existed since the 1500s. But the problem was they were very expensive, they were slow to load, and more often than not, well, they were quite unreliable. The blade remained the symbol of a gentleman's honor. Using a sword in a duel required extensive training and fencing, and was seen as a true test of skill and valor. In fact, when pistols first began to appear in duels, many aristocrats disdained them as cruel and ungentlemanly. The celebrated English writer Margaret Cavendish in the mid-1600s sneered that, quote, the sword was the weapon of men of valor, since it still took skill to manage, whereas resorting to pistols was for mean-bred persons lacking proper training. Well, such sentiments, whether they were widespread or not, certainly show that for the time, a pistol was viewed as a lower, less honorable tool compared to the elegant sword and the tradition that it carried. But nevertheless, societal and technological changes in the 18th century would soon elevate the pistol to prominence in affairs of honor. Well, regardless of how it's seen by a few of the writers of the nobility, by the late 17th century and into the early 1700s, pistols had improved in their reliability and accuracy, not the hand cannons that they used to be. Gradually, the pistol began to supplement and then supplant the sword in duels, particularly in the British and American tradition. It is actually a little bit difficult to pinpoint the very first pistol duel. Many early instances went unrecorded, which is unfortunate. But we do know that by the 1680s and 90s, pistols occasionally featured in personal combats alongside swords. Some early pistol duels were fought under unconventional circumstance. The French writer Brantome, reflecting on his experiences around 1600, noted that at first gentlemen would sometimes duel with pistols on horseback, at point-blank range, perhaps in an effort to make this new weapon seem more chivalrous by using it as cavalrymen. Over time, as pistols became more accepted, combatants dismounted and faced each other on foot as in a traditional duel. Still, throughout most of the 17th century, pistols remained a secondary choice, a novelty, or perhaps even a last resort when swords were impractical. Many duelists continue to consider the pistol's deadly power to be somewhat unsporting, at least compared to the finesse of swordplay. But then came the turning point in the mid-18th century. By this period, dueling with swords had led to a significant death toll among young nobles in countries like France and Italy, prompting repeated but ineffective edicts against dueling. At the same time, social attitudes were slowly shifting to see the pistol duel as a more civilized form of combat. A pistol duel could be resolved with a single exchange of shots, whereas sword fights could descend into bloody slashing bouts, just wild, stabbing frenzies. Pistols also arguably leveled the playing field. One did not need years of fencing training or youthful athleticism to participate. Older men, or those less skilled with a blade, could still demand satisfaction on roughly equal terms with a firearm. And quite ironically, the very fact that pistols were lethal and quick perhaps restrained some excesses. Pistols might end with one shot each, rather than an ongoing sword fight to the death. Now, in London, the first recorded pistol duel took place in 1711 at Tothill Fields. At that time, it was still an anomaly. British gentlemen continued favouring swords up through the early Georgian era. But from the 1760s onwards, the use of pistols in duels became increasingly common. By about 1770, gunsmiths in England and France were even producing specialized dueling pistols, matched pairs of finely crafted single-shot pistols, expressly made for accuracy, balance, and the reliability in the duelist's hand. These pistols had longer, often heavier barrels, sometimes octagonal in the later models, smooth bore or lightly scratch rifle interiors to stabilize the bullet, hair trigger mechanisms for a light, quick release, and a few other refinements. They were sold in elegant cases with accessories, becoming status symbols of a gentleman's readiness to defend his honor. And so as pistol duels spread, combatants and their seconds developed agreed conventions to ensure measures of fairness, and of course upholding the traditional honor of the duel. By custom, each duelist should be offered a matched pistol, or could bring his own pair to be swapped or chosen by lot, so neither really had a technical advantage. Loading was often done in the other's presence, or by trusted seconds, with careful attention to equal powder charges and ammunition. It was considered extremely dishonorable, and indeed murderous, to tamper with a weapon for undue advantage, such as secretly rifling a barrel or using an extra large powder load. Stories did circulate, of course, of unscrupulous duelists employing hidden rifling or hair triggers. but they were exceptions, not the rule. In most dueling situations, the emphasis was on honor, not just assassination. The ideal outcome was to vindicate one's courage without necessarily killing one's opponent. This principle influenced how pistol duels were arranged and conducted, as we shall see in a moment. The codification of a kind of dueling etiquette. You see, by the late 18th century, dueling had evolved into a highly ritualized kind of practice, governed by elaborate rules known as the Code Duello. Okay then. Anyway, different regions had their own versions of the code, but they all shared a few common themes. They sought to moderate the violence, prevent rash encounters, and define what constituted honorable behavior in a duel. Now, the most influential of these was the Irish Code Duello, a set of 27 rules agreed upon by gentlemen at the Clonmel Summer Assizes of 1777. This Irish code, which would be soon adopted widely in Britain and America, laid out everything from how challenges should be issued to the duties of seconds, the choice of weapons, and of course the conditions for the end of the encounter. For example, Rule 1 specified that no challenger could insist on an apology without giving his opponent a chance to make one. Rule 8 famously forbade deloping, that is, firing deliberately away from one's opponent, declaring that satisfaction could not be attained by a shot in the air. But the code also addressed practical details. The distance between duelists, often paced out by seconds, commonly 10 to 20 paces. Then there was the number of shots or rounds allowable, and even what to do in the case of a misfire. Now, under most codes, if a pistol failed to discharge, that still counted as the duelist's shot. Recocking for a second attempt was generally not permitted, lest one man effectively get two aims to the other one. Now, this rule put pressure on quality firearms and careful preparation, hence the high craftsmanship of the dueling pistols, but also introduced an element of chance that could sometimes spare a life if both missed or one gun misfired. Seconds, that is, the trusted friends who accompanied each principal, were charged with trying their utmost to avert bloodshed. According to the code, the second should attempt reconciliation up to the last moment, conveying apologies or retractions if either side wavered. Only when honor absolutely could not be satisfied by an apology would the seconds proceed to arrange the terms of combat. They oversaw the loading of pistols, measured the distance, and gave the signal to fire, all while ensuring scrupulous fairness. Now, the typical pistol duel under these rules proceeded as follows. The two adversaries would arrive at a secluded field at dawn. Now, the reason why they did it at dawn was mainly to avoid legal interruption, since, well, dueling was technically illegal almost everywhere. Well, accompanied by their seconds and possibly a surgeon in attendance, they would stand at an agreed distance, often back to back and at a signal, either a countered cadence or a dramatic drop of a handkerchief. The duelist would turn and fire within a prescribed window of time. A common method was a count, such as 1, 2, 3, fire, during which both shots should be taken. Now, a duelist who fired early, that is, before the signal or count, was considered to have violated the code, and in a rather notorious English case, a duelist who shot his opponent before the time was called and was actually prosecuted and even executed for murder. So, well, in an aim to save his own life, he rather ironically condemned himself to death. Now, on the other hand, overly delaying one shot after the count was also frowned upon as unsporting. Essentially, both men were to shoot roughly simultaneously, or not at all. A duelist who decided not to fire at his opponent could signal his intent by visibly discharging his pistol into the air. Now, that is the banned practice of deloping, which, though against strict rules, did occur as a gesture of magnanimity, or perhaps even repentance. Now, if neither man was hit in the first exchange, the code might allow the seconds to declare honor satisfied if an apology was offered and accepted. But if not, and if both demanded continued satisfaction, the pistols would be reloaded, and round 2 would begin. However, protracted duels with pistols were pretty uncommon. Most concluded after 1 or 2 exchanges, either because one party was wounded or because both sides felt they had demonstrated bravery, regardless of the outcome. Despite these attempts to civilize dueling, fatalities and grave injuries were quite common, as you can certainly understand. A lead pistol ball was a terribly destructive projectile, especially in short ranges customary in duels, often only 10 to 15 paces or roughly 30 to 45 feet. The large musket caliber balls, which were about half an inch or larger, fired from dueling pistols, could shatter bone and tore ragged wounds. And in an era of rudimentary medicine, even a survivable gunshot could lead to a lethal infection. Estimates from 19th century Britain suggest that about 20% of pistol duels proved fatal immediately or shortly after, and at least another 20% caused non-fatal wounds. Some historical records indicate that roughly 1 in 6 duels in England resulted in a death on the field, a rate tempered by the fact that many duelists intentionally did not aim to kill. In fact, hitting one's opponent at all was far from guaranteed. Smoothbore pistols at the time were not very accurate beyond a few dozen feet, and duelists under the extreme stress often missed. Add to that any conscious effort to avoid killing, such as raising one's arm slightly or firing on the signal without carefully taking sight, it's easy to see why many duels ended with both parties unharmed. A contemporary witticism by Mark Twain, nonetheless, satirized this notoriously poor marksmanship, or perhaps the merciful intentions of the French duelists. He quipped that the safest place to stand in a French duel was directly behind one of the combatants. In contrast, observers noted that German duelists of the 19th century took deadly aim with rifled pistols and had a much higher incidence of lethal outcome. I suppose it reflects a cultural difference in how earnestly the duel was treated, as mortal combat versus a symbolic show of courage. Now, one remarkable aspect of the Code Duello was its attempt to limit duels to matters of genuine honor and to exclude trivial cases. In practice, however, the threshold for offense remained quite low by modern standards. Men challenged each other over the slightest perceived insult, a murmured accusation of lying, a disparaging remark about a lady's virtue, even a disagreement over a game of cards, or a jostle in the theater, could spark a formal challenge. As the custom became entrenched, declining a challenge was almost unthinkable for a man of standing. It could result in a social ostracism. Thus, ironically, the Code Duello meant to regulate and reduce violence, sometimes enabled an epidemic of duels over frivolous quarrels. In any case, by the early 19th century, commentators were lamenting that men were dying for trifles, and I don't mean the tasty kind. Excuse me. Well, anyway. An infamous English duel in 1805, for instance, was provoked by an argument over 2 fighting dogs. An army officer and a navy officer's pets quarreled in Hyde Park, and the owners exchanged heated words about whose dog was at fault. And, well, by the evening, The gentlemen met with pistols at only 6 yards distance. One was killed, the other was grievously wounded. Such was the deadly seriousness with which honor was defended under the dueling code. So during the 18th and 19th centuries, that is the golden age of pistol dueling, which is a strange sentence, but all right. Many of society's most prominent figures either fought in duels or fell victim to them. Well, these encounters range from legendary and nation-shaking events to more intimate personal tragedies. So let's talk about a few of the more famous duels. And of course, we should start with perhaps the most famous pistol duel in history, the one we mentioned in our introduction, the confrontation between former U.S. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton and the Vice President Aaron Burr. Well, Burr, aggrieved by derogatory remarks that Hamilton allegedly made about him, challenged Hamilton to a duel. And so on July the 11th, 1804, they met at dawn on a New Jersey bluff. Now, dueling, of course, was illegal in New York, so they had to cross the river. In accordance with custom, both men's seconds turned their backs or looked away at the moment of firing to preserve deniability. The two shots rang out a few seconds apart. Hamilton's shot apparently went high into the trees, whether by intention, a last-minute decision to throw away his fire, or by misaim due to interference is still debated. Burr's shot struck Hamilton in the abdomen, a wound that proved fatal the next day. As for the public outcry, that was immense. Hamilton was a Federalist leader of national stature, and his death in a duel stunned the nation. Burr, though he survived unhurt, found himself condemned as a murderer by many, and his political career was, well, pretty much ruined. No one was going to vote for him anymore, weren't they? Unless he was going to duel them all for it. Maybe, I don't know. Well, the duel's notoriety contributed to a growing movement against dueling in the northern United States, even as it remained common in the South. Hamilton himself had been involved in numerous duels and conflicts of honor, as had most of his political contemporaries, and he approached the encounter with deep reluctance, writing a letter beforehand lamenting the injurious imputation on his honor that compelled him to participate despite moral and religious reservations. Well, his fate shows the tragic bind of honor culture. A man who personally opposed dueling, but still felt unable to refuse. It was all about reputation, I suppose. Now, the next one is the Duel of the Poets, which was in 1837. Of course, dueling was not confined to the Anglo-American world. It thrived in continental Europe. Now, this story comes from Russia. That great national poet, Alexander Pushkin, was eventually going to become a casualty of this system. Pushkin had been involved in several prior duels, mostly fought with pistols, and was acutely sensitive about his honor. In 1837, gossip spread that Pushkin's young wife had attracted the attention of Georges Danthey, a French-born guards officer. Provoked by what he perceived as a public humiliation and slander, Pushkin challenged Danthey to a duel. On a January afternoon, they met on the snow-covered outskirts of St. Petersburg. At the signal, both men fired. Pushkin was struck in the abdomen, while Danthey was only lightly wounded. The poet died 2 days later, after agonizing suffering. Now, as for the public reaction, well, the death of Pushkin sent Russia into national mourning, and also drew attention to the barbarity of dueling. Yet tragically, only 4 years later, the esteemed poet Mikhail Lermontov, considered Pushkin's literary heir, was also killed. Guess what? In another pistol duel, 1841 that one was, after quarreling with a fellow officer. Now, these losses show how dueling had permeated high society in Russia. It was often said that fashion came from France and dueling came too, embraced by the Russian elite despite sporadic efforts by the Tsars to forbid it. Now, in the case of Pushkin, Tsar Nicholas I was personally anguished, since he had promised to protect Pushkin. But even an autocrat's disfavor was not enough to dissuade men determined to settle the score with guns. Now, next we have the Duke of Wellington's duel in 1829. These aren't really chronological, by the way. We're just sort of going at the order of my personal interest with them. Of course, not even the great Iron Duke was immune from the demands of honor. So the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, famed victor over Napoleon, even served as British Prime Minister in 1829 when he championed a bill for Catholic emancipation, that is, extending civil rights to Catholics. Certainly a good way to get the Catholic vote. Well, this policy angered some conservatives, including the Earl of Winchelsea, who accused Wellington of betraying his Protestant duty. Well, enraged by this insinuation, Wellington challenged him to a duel. Well, given Wellington's stature, this caused quite a scandal. The hero of Waterloo engaging in a pistol duel on Battersea Fields. Unheard of. In any case, on that day Wellington intentionally fired wide, and the Earl honorably discharged his pistol into the air, having decided not to attempt to kill the national icon. The seconds quickly declared the matter resolved, after a symbolic exchange. Winchelsea had prepared a written apology in advance, which he presented following the shots. Both men thus saved face without having to kill each other. And even though this encounter was bloodless, it was one of the incidents that fueled the British establishment's drive to end dueling. It was unseemly for high officials to risk their lives over insults. The Duke's duel helped prompt stronger enforcement of anti-dueling laws, and ironically, Wellington himself later worked to delegitimize dueling in society, calling it a relic of a barbarous age. Now, the next one is far rarer than male encounters. The few documented cases of women dueling, sometimes called petticoat duels in contemporary jargon, and one of the most extraordinary ones took place in 1792 in England, involving Lady Almira Braddock and Miss Elphinstone. The two women, members of fashionable society, quarreled when Miss Elphinstone reportedly slighted Lady Braddock's age and social standing. Incensed at this, Lady Braddock demanded satisfaction, and so they met in London's Hyde Park, initially firing pistols at each other. According to admittedly colourful accounts, so pinch of salt with this one, Lady Braddock's shot grazed her opponent's hat. That's pretty lucky, isn't it? Well, when neither was seriously injured by pistol fire, the duel remarkably continued with swords. Apparently they had become prepared for both forms of combat. During the sword fight, Miss Elphinstone suffered a minor wound to her arm, and at that point, Lady Braddock declared herself to be satisfied since blood had been drawn. A written statement of reconciliation was drafted on the spot. Both combatants signed it, curtsied to one another, and then, well, everybody just went home. Pretty sensational story, but it was widely reported in pamphlets and newspapers at the time, and shows that women of the era, though not expected to duel, they had honor of their own, and on rare occasions they would come up and defend it. Another early instance from the 17th century France records that in 1665 two ladies-in-waiting to the Queen fought a pistol duel over a romantic dispute, and apparently when King Louis XIV heard of it, He supposedly had quite a bit of a giggle over the situation, thought it was quite hilarious, and he laughed that his prohibitions on dueling only applied to men, not women. That's interesting. Okay, next one. This was called the Balloon Duel of 1808, and as bizarre as it sounds, one of the most fantastical duels in history reportedly took place in the skies above Paris. In 1808, two Frenchmen, that is, Monsieur de Grandpré and Monsieur Lepic, quarreled over a lady, the common catalyst for many a duel, and certainly not breaking any French stereotypes. To make their encounter memorable, and perhaps to one-up all of the previous duelers, they agreed to fight in hot air balloons. I mean, points for creativity, right? Well, on the day of the contest, each duelist climbed into a basket of his own balloon, along with a blunderbuss-style pistol, and ascended into the sky above the city where a crowd watched on from below. At a certain height, drifting in the morning breeze, Lepic fired his shotgun-like pistol, but he missed, harmlessly puncturing the empty sky. Grandpré then took aim at Lepic's balloon, and his shot hit home. The balloon's gas envelope was torn, causing it to rapidly deflate. Lepic's balloon plunged, crashing into a rooftop and killing him, and his poor second who had ascended with him. Grandpré, meanwhile, triumphed as the first and only victor of an aerial duel, drifting away to safety. Whether it's somewhat embellished or not, it was still reported in contemporary journals, and has entered legend as evidence of the lengths to which men would go to settle matters of honor, reaching absurd heights. It's a good one. Well, it almost demonstrates a bit of a theatrical and performative aspect that duels could take on in the Romantic Age, as participants sought to turn their clash into a grand, deadly adventure. Now, not all duelists sought moderation. Some seemed almost bent on mutual destruction. A notorious American example is the duel between General Armistead Mason and Colonel John McCarthy in 1818 in Virginia. These two men, former friends, turned into bitter political rivals, and also cousins by marriage, by the way, found their animosity escalating beyond repair. Challenges were issued, and initially rebuffed with outrageous counter-proposals. McCarthy at one point actually suggested fighting on top of a powder keg, or in closed rooms with knives to ridicule Mason's eagerness. Eventually, pushed by social pressure, and reportedly after being egged on by none other than Andrew Jackson, who told Mason that he must demand satisfaction or just be branded a coward. Responsible friend right there, I suppose. They agreed on terms so brutal as to almost guarantee death. Double-barreled shotguns, loaded with the ball, at a mere 12 feet apart, which is approximately 4 paces. Now this distance was essentially point blank. Neither man could miss. At the break of day, the two stood so close that they could almost reach out and touch the muzzles of the other's guns. And when the signal came, Mason was slightly slower to fire. McCarthy's shot tore into his chest, killing him instantly. Mason did get off one barrel, shattering McCarthy's arm, but McCarthy survived the encounter. The ghastly duel shocked even contemporary onlookers who viewed it more like a deliberate execution, or some kind of mutual pact to take each other's lives rather than an honorable contest. And indeed, the Code Duello typically forbade such excessively deadly arrangements. There was an understanding that combatants could not insist on too short a distance as it verged on murder. In any case, the Mason-McCarthy duel is one where hatred overwhelmed the restraint normally imposed by seconds and code. Extremes like that were uncommon, but they certainly served to strengthen calls for an end to dueling altogether. Next we have the longest duel. Dueling legends also include protracted feuds that produce not just one duel, but dozens. The most famous is the saga of French officers Pierre Dupont and Francois Fournier, who fought a series of duels over an astonishing 19-year period. It all began in 1794 during the Napoleonic Wars, with a trivial insult between two cavalrymen. Their first sword duel ended with neither one seriously hurt, but neither satisfied either. Fournier, known as one of the most fanatical and skilled duelists in Napoleon's army, kept the challenge alive. Whenever chance brought them into the same vicinity, they fought again, with swords or pistols depending on circumstance. According to popular accounts, they dueled at least 30 times, across different battlefields and peacetime postings, sometimes on horseback and sometimes on foot. They sustained a few minor wounds, but each encounter they survived. Now eventually, in 1813, the weary Dupont, by then a general, contrived a final pistol duel with precise terms to conclusively end the affair. They agreed to fire at close range. Dupont wounded Fournier, and at last they declared the feud resolved. It's pretty remarkable, I think. It has, however, been embellished and retold in novella and film. If you're not aware, the work The Duel by Joseph Conrad, who's famous for his interesting book titles, that was about this specific event. In any case, it shows how the Code of Honor could turn into an obsessive personal vendetta. I mean, 19 years. It's quite long. In any case, Dupont and Fournier developed a kind of begrudging camaraderie, even as they tried to repeatedly kill or maim each other for honor's sake. And this barely scratches the surface of duel lore. Countless other duels became part of local folklore and national history. The 1838 duel in the U.S., where Congressman William Graves killed Congressman Jonathan Keeley, prompting public outrage at elected officials resorting to violence. The 1840 duel of the French Prime Minister Edouard Drouin de Lhuys. Oh no, that's a difficult French name, you'll have to forgive me. In any case, he survived. The many editor duels in journalism hotbeds like 19th century New Orleans, where rival newspaper editors regularly exchanged shots over libelous articles. In any case, each duel story carries its own drama. But collectively, we're left with a picture of a world where personal honor, professional rivalries, love triangles, and political disputes all might lead to the same field combat at dawn, with a pair of pistols as the final judges. Well, while the basic ritual of the duel was pretty similar across different countries, two individuals facing off with deadly weapons under formal rules, well, there were notable regional variations in how dueling culture played out. Attitudes towards pistol dueling, preferred weapons, and the social classes, well, they all changed to a certain extent in different places. In Great Britain, dueling by the 18th century was primarily the domain of aristocrats, military officers, and gentlemen of the upper class. British duels were almost exclusively fought with pistols after the 1760s. Sword duels had become quite rare in England after the mid-18th century, as pistols took precedence. British duelists, influenced by the Irish Code and gentlemen's clubs, often showed a certain amount of restraint. There was an unspoken preference of affairs of honor to end without fatality where possible, provided both participants demonstrated bravery. This partly explains why British fatality rates were relatively low. Many British duels ended after the first exchange of shots with nobody hit, at which point seconds would declare honor to be satisfied. By the Victorian era, dueling in Britain was on the decline, increasingly condemned as uncivilized and against Christian morality. Queen Victoria herself was an outspoken opponent, and Prince Albert helped push through a change in military regulations in 1844 forbidding officers from issuing or accepting challenges, creating instead courts of honor as a substitute forum for grievances. The last fatal duel on English soil occurred in 1845, as noted earlier, and by the 1850s the practice had essentially died out in the UK. Therefore, to call someone out for a pistol duel in London would likely invite ridicule rather than respect. Go to bed, Grandpa, that kind of thing. The British public opinion had decisively turned against the custom, seeing it as a foolish vestige of a bygone age. Now, over in France, dueling persisted robustly through the 19th century, but with a bit of a twist. The French aristocracy and the upper classes often preferred the sword, an épée or a rapier for duels, well into the late 1800s. French duelists certainly used pistols as well, especially into the early 19th century and for certain high-profile affairs. However, French culture retained a strong fencing tradition. Many French duels among politicians, journalists, and military officers in the later 19th century were fought with rapiers to first blood, meaning the duel would stop as soon as one combatant incurred a bleeding wound, usually a relatively minor cut. Well, this practice often spared lives, and became almost a formality, albeit a dangerous one in French public life. It was not uncommon for any heated dispute in the French Chamber of Deputies or the press to result in a challenge. A quick sword duel in a private fencing salon, and a bandaged arm or scratch on the face to show for it. Not too bad. Of course, pistol duels did continue in France, but swords offered a way to satisfy honor with less risk of death, which likely contributed to dueling's longevity there. And indeed, France holds the rather melancholy distinction of hosting what is considered the last formal duel in Western Europe. You'd be surprised. It was in 1967, well over a century after most nations had abandoned the practice. The mayor of Marseille, Gaston Defferre, fought a duel with a political opponent, René Ribière. The cause was an insult that Defferre had flung at Ribière during a parliamentary debate. "Shut up, stupid," which is, well, pretty insulting, right? Ribière, feeling aggrieved, challenged Defferre. They met with épées, not pistols, in a secluded garden near Paris. The duel was even filmed by news cameras. Defferre, the elder man, wounded Ribière lightly twice, after which the seconds halted the contest. While no pistols were involved in the 1967 event, it marked the ceremonial end of a long French dueling tradition, a coda showing how deeply embedded the notion of the duel of honor had been in French society, that it lasted well into the 20th century in some form. Well, let's look at Central Europe, particularly among the German-speaking countries. Dueling took on an especially strict and deadly character. The Prussian and Austrian officer corps of the 19th century embraced dueling as a matter of course. It was said an officer who had not fought at least one duel was scarcely considered to be a man. Many of these were saber duels, especially the famous academic duels or the mensuren among university students, which aimed only to scar the face, not to kill. But pistol duels were also common among military men. Unlike the British notion of gentlemanly forbearance, German dueling culture encouraged precision, and with it, lethal intent. There was less stigma in aiming carefully to hit your adversary. In fact, by the late 1800s, Some German duel codes even allowed rifled pistols and dispensed with the simultaneous fire requirement. Duelists might take turns firing deliberately, a practice that increased accuracy. As a result, the mortality rate in German pistol duels was higher, and the encounters more often did end with one party dead or at least gravely wounded. While this approach reflected perhaps a less romantically softened view of the duel, it was truly a trial by mortal combat to defend honor, with the implicit understanding that honor might demand one's life, or if you were lucky, your opponent's. The seriousness with which Germans treated dueling also meant that the custom lingered for longer in their military culture. It wasn't until after World War I and the fall of after many monarchies that dueling was definitively outlawed in German and Austrian armed forces. And of course, then, there are the Americans, who had a split experience with dueling, largely along regional lines. In the northern United States, particularly New England and some mid-Atlantic states, dueling was heavily stigmatized and legally prosecuted from early on, influenced by religious and moral opposition. After the Hamilton-Burr duel, for example, New York and New Jersey cracked down with harsher anti-dueling measures, though Burr had already invaded them by choosing to cross the river to New Jersey. But, it is what it is, isn't it? States like Massachusetts had long banned duels and enforced penalties. By the 1830s, it was pretty rare to hear of a duel in the northern states. But in contrast, the American South and West cultivated dueling culture passionately through the first half of the 19th century. Southern gentlemen, as lawyers, plantation owners, politicians, often considered dueling an integral part of their honor code, intertwined with the ideals of chivalry and masculinity. Many U.S. presidents and statesmen from the South participated in duels or near duels. Andrew Jackson, as a young Tennessee lawyer, fought several of them, most famously killing Charles Dickinson in 1806 after a dispute in which Dickinson had insulted Jackson's wife. Jackson was hit in the chest in that duel, but remained standing and returned a fatal shot. He carried the bullet in his body for the rest of his life, a grisly badge of honor. Far from disqualifying him, such exploits earned him a more, kind of like a frontier warrior reputation, I suppose. The South's devotion to dueling led to famous law codes like the Code of Honor, published in 1838 by John Lyde Wilson, a former governor of South Carolina. Wilson's code was a comprehensive American Southern guide to dueling etiquette, clearly modeled on the earlier European codes, but adapted more for local use. It covered the minutiae, such as how to word a challenge letter, and how many paces to use under various circumstances. It shows how seriously the ritual was still taken. It was practically a legal system parallel to the actual law. Only after the Civil War in 1861–65 did dueling in the South wane significantly, as the immense bloodshed of that conflict and Reconstruction changed social attitudes, and the South was brought under the national fold with modernizing influences that frowned upon extra-legal violence. One of the last notable American duels occurred in 1859 in California. The U.S. Senator David Broderick was shot dead by former Chief Justice of California David Terry over a political difference related to slavery. The shock of that event, an anti-slavery senator slain by a pro-slavery judge near the eve of the Civil War, was pretty symbolic. After the war, duels in America became sporadic relics, and by the 1880s, a person challenging another to pistols was more likely to be mocked in the press as an archaic or uncivilized person, rather than praised for their bravery. Of course, beyond Europe and America, the phenomenon of dueling also appeared wherever European influence spread. In Latin America, for instance, 19th century elites, many of them educated in Europe or influenced by European customs, sometimes engaged in their own pistol duels. These could attain high stakes. In 1920, in Uruguay, a sitting former president, José Batil Ordóñez, fought a formal pistol duel with Washington Beltran, a journalist and political adversary. The dispute arose from vitriolic newspaper editorials. In a dramatic sunrise meeting, Battle shot and killed Beltran. The incident caused a sensation in Uruguay. Rather than being treated entirely as a crime, it was seen through the lens of the old honor code. Battle even temporarily went into exile to placate the public feeling. But later he came back to politics and probably just tried to pretend like nothing ever happened. Such late survival of dueling in Latin America shows how the custom persisted in societies that prided themselves on European-style gentility and honor. But similarly, dueling traditions took root in colonies and territories under European rule. British officers in colonial India, for example, occasionally dueled one another, though it was officially forbidden by army regulation. There were instances of duels in Canada, Australia, and elsewhere in the 18th and 19th centuries, generally carried out by expatriates or local gentry who had adopted the practice. And again, there might have been duels among the lower classes that we just don't hear of, but who knows? Notably, in cultures with very different martial traditions, such as East Asia or the Islamic world, Western-style dueling never really became widespread. Concepts of honor certainly exist, but the ritualized pistol duel was a distinctly Western import. In Japan, for example, questions of honor were historically settled by samurai sword fights or ritual seppuku, rather than imported firearm duels. And in the 19th century, the Japanese largely viewed Western duels as curious foreign customs. In the Ottoman Empire or Persia, aristocrats might engage in arranged single combats, but these did not follow the same code as the European duel. Thus, while you can speak of dueling as a global phenomenon in the age of European empires, it was really a case of Western cultural practice, being transplanted abroad rather than an independent development in each region. And just like that, it's over. We are done with the video for today. I really do hope that you enjoyed it and you learned a lot about pistol duels. Yeah, it was good, like, to have these sorts of different topics. It's just a bit of a random thing, is it? But it's quite interesting. I think so. Now, we will thank our top tier patrons and YouTube members: Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Overneer, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftas, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katie P, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Brinny, Aiden, Fabian, Michael, Agvirm, Prince of Persia, River Indian Trail, and Catherine. And that's it. Well, thank you very much for joining me. I will say again, hope you enjoyed our time here tonight or today, whenever you're listening from. And I will see you when you feel inclined to return. Good night for now. Lots of love to you all. And remember to drink plenty of water. And don't go dueling anybody. Good night.